The dust of Redemption Creek settled on everything, even on the tears that traced clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She stood at the altar, a ghost in white lace, her reflection warped in the smug eyes of the man whose name she was about to take. Every word of the preacher's sermon was a nail in her coffin, every promise a lie she was forced to speak. The town watched, some with pity, most with the cold satisfaction of seeing the proud Thompson family brought to heel. But in the back, leaning against the rough-hewn church wall, was a man who saw not a bride, but a captive. And as her voice broke on the vow, a whisper low and fierce as a desert wind reached her ears alone, carrying a promise that would ignite a rebellion in her shattered heart. The heat in the unfinished church was suffocating thick with the scent of raw pine sweat and the cloying sweetness of the wild roses Bartholomew Corbin had ordered, shipped in from 3 territories away. For Clara May Thompson, each breath was a struggle, a desperate pull against the whalebone corset that felt less like a garment and more like a cage for her hammering heart. Her veil of fine Belgian lace that had cost more than her father's prize. Bull clung to her damp face, a gossamer prison obscuring a world that had become a nightmare. And do you, Clara May, take this man, Bartholomew Corbin, to be your lawfully wedded husband? Preacher Davies's voice boomed, trying to fill the small space with a sanctity it didn't possess. Clara May's eyes lifted from the scuffed toes of her satin shoes. She saw the expectant faces in the pews. The mayor, Samuel Blackwood, a man whose political career was financed by Corbin. The ranchers, small and large, who owed Corbin money or feared his influence. Their wives whispering behind their fans, their eyes, a mixture of envy at her new wealth and pity for its cost. Then her gaze found her father, Franklin Thompson, standing in the front row. His shoulders were slumped, his face a mask of grey defeat. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He couldn't. He had sold her his only child to save a ranch that was already dying to settle a debt deliberately engineered by the man now holding her hand. Bartholomew Corbin squeezed her fingers. His hand was thick, meaty, the skin unnaturally smooth for a man who owned half the territory. He smelled of expensive cigars and bay rum, a scent she had come to associate with dread. He was 25 years her senior, with a florid complexion and pale, watchful eyes that seemed to assess the value in everything, including her. He smiled, a thin, proprietary curl of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who had just acquired a prized filly for his stable. "My dear." He prompted his voice, a low rumble, meant to sound reassuring, but which only tightened the knot of ice in her stomach. Her voice was a fragile thing, a mere thread of sound. She cleared her throat, the sound raw and loud in the sudden silence. The tears she had been fighting all morning finally broke free, hot and shameful. They slipped from beneath her lashes, blurring the faces before her into a watercolor wash of judgment. She cried for her lost future, for the young homesteader Adam, whose simple courtship had been brutally ended by Corbin's machinations. She cried for her father's broken spirit. Most of all, she cried for the girl she used to be, the one who believed in love and the promise of a dusty sunset. Through the shimmering curtain of her tears, a figure in the back of the church came into focus. He wasn't sitting in the pews like the others. He stood alone in the shadows by the door as if ready to bolt at any moment. He was tall and lean, dressed not in a suit but in worn buckskins and a simple cotton shirt. His black hair was long tied back with a leather cord. His face was all sharp angles and stark planes, his skin the color of burnished copper, telling of a heritage the townspeople both feared and scorned. It was Cale. He did odd jobs tracking for the sheriff when a man went missing, breaking the wildest horses no one else could tame. He was a phantom in Redemption Creek, a man of two worlds who belonged to neither. The townsfolk called him the Apache half-breed, a label they used like a brand. He rarely spoke, and his eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to see right through the town's flimsy veneer of civility. Clara May had seen him before, of course, a silent presence on the edge of town, but she had never truly looked at him. Now she did. And he was looking back, not with pity, not with judgment, but with a startling intensity, a shared understanding of what it felt like to be trapped. In that moment, across the suffocating space of the church, she felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was a strange, silent communion. He saw her, not as Corbin's prize, not as Thompson's debt, but as a soul in chains. I do. She whispered the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. The lie was spoken. The bargain was sealed. Corbin slid a heavy gold band onto her finger. It felt cold as a shackle. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Corbin, without waiting for permission, turned her, lifted the veil with a flourish, and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was wet and possessive, a public branding. A wave of revulsion, so strong it made her dizzy, washed over Clara May. She closed her eyes, her tears now flowing freely, a silent, desperate protest against her fate. As the townsfolk began to applaud a hollow, tinny sound, Corbin turned her to face their audience, his arm a steel band around her waist. "My wife," he announced, his voice booming with triumph. Over his shoulder, her tear-filled eyes found the shadows at the back of the church again. The man Kyle was still there, his expression unreadable. As Corbin began to lead her down the aisle through the gauntlet of false smiles and whispered congratulations, they drew level with the back wall. For a single fleeting second, his path crossed hers. The world seemed to slow the noise of the crowd, fading to a dull roar. He moved his lips, but the sound was for her alone, a whisper that cut through her misery like a sharpened blade. It was low, rough-hewn, yet carried a profound certainty. "I'll make you smile someday." The words were so unexpected, so impossible, that her tears momentarily ceased. Her head snapped toward him, but he was already melting back into the shadows, a ghost slipping out the door into the unforgiving sunlight. The promise hung in the air, a tiny, impossible seed of hope planted in the barren wasteland of her heart. Bartholomew Corbin, oblivious, pulled her forward, leading his weeping bride out into a life she never wanted, unaware that the quietest man in the territory had just declared a silent war. The Corbin Ranch was a sprawling monument to its owner's ambition. The main house stood on a rise overlooking the valley, a two-story Victorian monstrosity of carved wood and imported glass that looked profoundly out of place in the rugged landscape. It was a palace built on greed, every floorboard polished, every window pane spotless. And for Clara May, it was the most beautiful prison she had ever seen. The first few weeks of her marriage were a blur of suffocating opulence. Corbin paraded her around like a new saddle, hosting dinners for businessmen from the East and lavish parties for the local sycophants. He bought her dresses of silk and satin jewelry that felt heavy and cold against her skin, and expected her to play the role of the adoring wife. She learned to smile when he entered a room, to laugh at his crude jokes, and to still the tremor in her hands when he placed his possessive hand on the small of her back. Her life was governed by a strict, unspoken set of rules. She was not to leave the ranch without his permission. She was not to speak of her family's unfortunate circumstances. She was to oversee the household staff, a stern housekeeper named Mrs. Gable, and 2 timid maids, but was to have no say in the ranch's business. Her days were long and empty, spent wandering the cavernous rooms, the silence broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, each tick marking another moment of her life slipping away. Corbyn's cruelty was not one of overt physical violence, but of 1,000 small soul-crushing cuts. He would belittle her opinions in front of guests, calling her "my naive little country flower." He would question her about her daily activities, his inquiries feeling more like interrogations. One evening she found a small, worn book of poetry that had belonged to her mother. She was reading it by the fire when Corbyn entered. "What's this sentimental nonsense?" he sneered, snatching it from her hands. He flipped through the pages with disdain. "Thompson's library. Pathetic. A man reads ledgers and contracts, my dear, not this drivel." He tossed the book into the flames. Clara May gasped a cry of genuine pain escaping her lips as she watched the brittle pages curl and blacken. She lunged for it, but he grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Leave it," he commanded, his voice cold. "Your life is here now. It's time you forgot the poverty you came from." She stood, frozen tears streaming down her face as the last of her mother's memory turned to ash. That night she understood that he didn't just want to own her, he wanted to erase her. It was during her lonely explorations of the house that she began to notice things. Corbyn's study was the one room that was strictly forbidden to her. He kept it locked, and Mrs. Gable had firm instructions that it was never to be dusted or entered unless he was present. From the hallway she could hear him late at night, his voice a low murmur, as he met with men she never saw arrive. Men like Caleb Thorne, his brutish ranch foreman, whose eyes lingered on her with a predatory gleam that made her skin crawl. One day, driven by a desperate need for a connection to her past, she rode her mare Daisy to the edge of the Corbyn property, where it bordered what was left of her father's land. She sat on a ridge, looking at the familiar, smaller ranch house, a wave of homesickness washing over her. She hadn't seen her father since the wedding. Corbyn had made it clear that, while he wouldn't forbid visits, he considered it unseemly for his wife to associate with her family's failure. As she sat there, a glint of colour in the drab brush caught her eye. She dismounted and walked over. Tucked carefully into the branches of a sagebrush was a single perfect Indian paintbrush, its vibrant scarlet, a startling contrast to the muted landscape. It was fresh, its stem still moist. It couldn't have grown there. Someone had placed it. Her mind immediately went to the church, to the man in the shadows, to Kyle. It became a silent ritual. Every few days she would ride to the same spot, and every time there would be a small token waiting. A uniquely patterned hawk feather, a smoothly polished river stone that was cool to the touch, a sprig of wild mint. They were small, simple things, yet they were lifelines. They were messages that said, "You are not forgotten. You are not alone." They were a stark contrast to the cold, expensive jewels Corbyn draped on her. Kyle's gifts were pieces of the land of the world outside her cage. Corbyn's were the bars of it. This secret correspondence fueled a tiny spark of defiance within her. She began to pay closer attention to the goings-on at the ranch. She listened to the hushed conversations between the ranch hands. She noted the late-night wagons that came and went from the northern pastures, the ones that never seemed to carry Corbyn's brand. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive house, she walked down to the stables. She heard raised voices coming from the tack room. It was Corbyn and his foreman, Thorne. "Getting too risky?" Thorne was saying, his voice a low growl. "Sheriff Miller is getting questions from the folks over at Stone Creek. Their herds are looking thin." "Miller is an old fool and he's on my payroll," Corbyn retorted, his voice sharp with irritation. "We just need to be smarter. Change the routes. The Circle T brand is easy enough to alter into our Box C. It's been working for a year. Circle T. That was the brand of the Thompson ranch, her father's ranch. A cold dread washed over Clara May. It wasn't just a debt. Corbin hadn't simply capitalized on her father's misfortune. He had created it. He had been systematically stealing from her father, bleeding him dry, all to force him into a corner where selling his daughter was the only option left. The sound of footsteps approaching the door sent a jolt of panic through her. She ducked behind a stack of hay bales just as the door swung open. Corbin and Thorne emerged, their faces grim. They didn't see her. She waited until they were gone, her body trembling, her mind reeling. The gilded cage had suddenly become far more sinister. It wasn't just a prison of circumstance. It was built on a foundation of lies and theft. The man she was married to wasn't just cruel. He was a common criminal, a rustler hiding behind a veneer of wealth. As she stumbled back toward the house, her despair began to curdle into something else, something harder and colder, rage. The quiet weeping bride was beginning to disappear. In her place, a woman with nothing left to lose was starting to take shape. And the lonely Apache's whispered promise no longer sounded like a distant hope. It sounded like a call to arms. The decision to seek out Cale was not born of courage, but of pure desperation. For 3 days after overhearing Corbin, Clara May lived in a state of heightened fear, seeing accusation in every glance from the household staff and veiled threats in her husband's every word. The knowledge she possessed was a dangerous weight. It could destroy Corbin, but if she was discovered, she had no doubt it would destroy her first. She needed an ally, someone outside Corbin's web of influence. She needed the only person in Redemption Creek who had ever looked at her with something other than pity or greed. She used the only currency she had feigned submission. She feigned a headache, a common occurrence Corbin dismissed with an impatient wave of his hand, and retired to her room early one evening. Once she heard the heavy tread of his boots go down the hall to his study, she slipped out of her silk nightgown and into a plain, dark riding skirt and blouse. She crept down the back staircase, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The house was silent, but every creak of a floorboard sounded like a gunshot. Outside, the cool night air was a shock to her senses. The moon was a slender sliver providing little light. She saddled Daisy herself in the dark stables, her hands clumsy but determined. Riding out, she avoided the main path, keeping to the shadows of the cottonwoods that lined the creek bed. Every rustle of leaves, every coyote's howl sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She didn't know where he lived, only that he was often seen near the old abandoned mission on the edge of the territory. It was a ruin, a place most folks avoided, whispering that it was haunted. To Clara May, it seemed the perfect place for a man who was himself a ghost. As she neared the crumbling adobe walls, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness. Daisy shied, snorting nervously. "Easy, girl." A low voice calmed the horse before it addressed her. "You are a long way from home, Mrs. Corbin." Cale stepped into the faint moonlight. He held no weapon, yet his presence was commanding. He moved with a silent grace that was almost unnerving. "How did you know I was coming?" Clara May whispered, her voice trembling. "A rider in the dark avoiding the road makes a certain kind of sound," he said simply. "It is not the sound of a person who is content." His gaze was steady, searching her face. "Why are you here?" The directness of the question disarmed her. There was no room for pretense. She slid from her horse, the words tumbling out of her in a frantic, hushed torrent. She told him everything, the conversation she'd overheard, the Circle T brand, her father's ruin, the way Corbin had systematically engineered her family's downfall to trap her. He listened without interruption, his expression unchanging, but she could feel the intensity of his focus. He was not just hearing her words. He was weighing them, absorbing them. When she finished, a heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the chirping of crickets. "You believe me?" She finally asked the question, laced with a desperate plea. "I have watched Bartholomew Corbin for a long time." Kyle said, his voice a low rumble. "I have seen wagons move at night when they should be still. I have found carcasses of cattle with their brands crudely cut away. I didn't have the proof, only the whispers on the wind. You have given those whispers a voice." "What can I do?" she asked. "I'm his wife. I'm trapped. If he even suspects, he has power." Kyle acknowledged his gaze sweeping over the dark valley, over the distant lights of the Corbin ranch. He has brought the law in this town, but men like Corbin have a weakness. They are arrogant. They believe themselves untouchable, and they keep records. His eyes met hers again. His study, the one he keeps locked, that is where he hides his true self. A ledger, a contract, a map. Something to prove what you heard is true. The thought of breaking into Corbin's study sent a chill down her spine. It was the heart of his empire, his sanctuary. "It's always locked. I could never get in. He will not be there forever. You live in that house. You see his comings and goings. You must find a time. And you must find the key." Kyle took a step closer. The proximity was startling. He smelled of wood smoke and leather and the clean scent of the desert night. "This is a dangerous path you choose." "I have nothing left to lose," she said, and for the first time, the words felt true, not just like a statement of despair. "You have your life," he countered softly. His intensity was unnerving. She felt a question rising in her, a question that had been haunting her since the wedding day. "Why are you helping me? The gifts, the feather, the stone. Why?" A flicker of something pain, a long-buried memory crossed his features before his mask of stoicism fell back into place. "Corbin took more than just your future," he said, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. "Years ago this land, the valley his house now stands on it, belonged to my mother's people. He came with a piece of paper from the government, backed by men with rifles. My father tried to fight him to argue for his wife's rights. He was shot and killed for trespassing on his own land. My mother died of a broken heart a season later." The confession hung in the air, stark and brutal. His loneliness, his silence, it was not just a disposition. It was a carefully constructed fortress around a deep well of grief and injustice. His fight against Corbin was not just for her, it was for the ghosts of his past. "He built his house on my family's graves." Kyle finished his voice, devoid of emotion, which somehow made the statement even more chilling. "I will see it torn down." A new bond forged in shared pain, and a mutual enemy solidified between them under the sliver of moon. He was no longer just a mysterious stranger. He was a man with a history as tragic as her own. "When you find a way into that room," he said, his tone shifting back to the practical, "leave a sign. Tie a strip of white cloth to the branch of the cottonwood at the edge of your property. The one that stands alone. I will see it. Do not come here again. It is too great a risk." He reached out not to touch her, but to gently stroke Daisy's muzzle, his connection with the animal immediate and calming. "Go now. The sky will lighten soon." Clara May mounted her horse, her mind racing with a terrifying, exhilarating purpose. As she turned to leave, she paused. "Kyle." She said the name feeling unfamiliar, yet right on her tongue. "Thank you." He simply nodded a silhouette against the crumbling mission. "Be careful, Clara May. A cornered snake is at its most venomous." She rode back, not with the frantic fear of her journey out, but with a cold, clear resolve. The whispers on the wind had become a plan. The gilded cage now had a locked door, and she was determined to find the key to open it, not just for her own freedom, but for the justice Kyle had been denied for so long. The search for the key became Clara May's obsession. She moved through her days in a state of hyper-awareness, watching Corbin's every move, memorizing his routines, all while maintaining the facade of a docile, melancholic wife. She learned that he carried a heavy ring of keys on his belt, but the one for his study was different. Smaller, made of brass, and kept separately in his waistcoat pocket. Taking it from him directly was impossible. She would have to find a time when he was without it. Her opportunity came nearly 2 weeks later, during one of the hottest spells of the summer. A wealthy cattle baron from Cheyenne, a Mr. Alistair Finch, was visiting to finalize a massive land deal. The negotiations, fueled by whiskey and cigars, stretched late into the night in Corbin's study. Clara May, dismissed hours earlier, lay awake in her bed, listening to the low murmur of their voices. Around 2 a.m, a commotion erupted. Mr. Finch, a notoriously heavy drinker, had collapsed. A frantic call went out for the doctor. In the ensuing chaos, Corbin, his face flushed with panic and anger at the interruption, rushed from the study, forgetting in his haste to lock the door behind him. He followed the men carrying Finch to a guest room, shouting orders at Mrs. Gable. This was it. Her heart hammering against her ribs so hard, she felt it in her throat. Clara May slipped out of bed. The house was a hive of activity, but all of it was focused on the west wing. The study was in the east. Barefoot, she crept down the hallway, the polished wood cold beneath her feet. The study door was ajar, a sliver of lamplight spilling into the hall. She pushed it open and slipped inside, closing it gently behind her. The room smelled of leather, stale, smoke, and power. A massive oak desk dominated the space, littered with maps and contracts. A fire left to die down cast flickering shadows on the walls, which were lined with bookshelves, filled not with books, but with identical leather-bound ledgers. There had to be 24 of them. Panic began to set in. She had no idea what she was looking for. She ran a finger along the spines. They were all labeled by year. She pulled one at random, 1874. She opened it on the desk. It was filled with Corbin's meticulous script detailing transactions, sales, and payrolls. It all looked legitimate. Frustrated, she pulled another, then another. They were all the same. Her eyes fell on a small, locked strongbox, tucked away on a lower shelf behind a row of law books. It was old and heavy. This had to be it. But it was locked, and she had no key. Despair washed over her. She had gotten in, but she was no closer to the truth. Just as she was about to give up, her gaze landed on the desk again. Beneath a stack of papers was a single smaller book, its leather a different color, a dark oxblood red. It had no year on its spine. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The script was the same, but the entries were different. They weren't just numbers, they were coded. Names were replaced with initials, ranches were given nicknames, and next to each entry was a second set of numbers much smaller than the first. She saw the entry, Circle T, Acquisition, FT, Final Payment due 5 to 12 to 76, but alongside it were notes, Cattle Transfers N Pasture, 475, 875, 176, Thorn Handling Rebranding. This was it, the secret ledger, the record of his crimes. Suddenly a voice from the hallway jolted her. "Mr. Corbin, the doctor is here." It was Mrs. Gable. Clara May's blood ran cold. He would be coming back. She couldn't take the ledger. He would know instantly it was gone. She had to hide it. But where her eyes darted around the room, moving it to another shelf was too risky. Then she saw the dying fire. The hearth was deep, the chimney breast wide. Above the mantelpiece was a large, gaudy oil painting of a stag. Acting on pure instinct, she grabbed a poker, pried the painting away from the wall just enough to create a gap at the top, and slid the ledger into the dark space behind it. It fit perfectly. She pressed the painting back into place and scattered the papers on the desk to look as they had before. She slipped out of the study, pulling the door to, and was halfway down the hall when Corbin appeared at the other end. "Clara May, what are you doing out of bed?" he demanded, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I heard the commotion," she said, forcing her voice to sound sleepy and frightened. "I was worried. Is Mr. Finch all right?" Her performance seemed to convince him. His expression softened with irritation rather than suspicion. The old fool drank himself into a stupor. "Go back to bed. This is none of your concern." He strode past her and went into the study, closing the door firmly. She didn't wait to see if he locked it. She fled back to the safety of her room, her body shaking uncontrollably. The next morning, she rode to the lone cottonwood tree and tied a strip of white linen, torn from an old petticoat, to a low-hanging branch. The signal was given. 2 days later, she received a message. One of the maids, a young girl named Rose, handed her a small package, saying a man had left it for her at the main gate. "He said it was medicine for your headaches, Mum." Rose said, her eyes wide with curiosity. Inside the burlap wrapping was a bundle of dried herbs, and beneath them a folded note. The handwriting was rough, unfamiliar. She opened it with trembling fingers. It wasn't from Cole. It was from her father. "Clara May, I can no longer live with what I have done. Corbin's debt was not just money. Years ago, in a harsh winter, I was desperate. I rebranded a handful of strays from his herd to feed my family. I thought no one knew. He knew. He has held it over my head ever since. The rustling he accused me of was nothing compared to his own, but my small crime was the leverage he needed. He forced my hand in your marriage, promising to destroy me to see me hang if I refused. Forgive me, my daughter. I have failed you in every way a father can. By the time you read this, I will be gone. I have sold what is left of the ranch to a homesteader family and am heading west. Do not follow. Live your life. Be free. Your loving father, Franklin." The note fell from her fingers. He was gone. The guilt that had driven him, the secret shame he had carried, had finally broken him. But in his confession, he had given her a final, crucial piece of the puzzle. Corbin's blackmail wasn't just about money. It was rooted in a hypocrisy so profound it was staggering. He had used her father's minor sin to hide his own sprawling criminal enterprise. The grief for her father was a sharp physical pain, but beneath it, her resolve hardened into tempered steel. This was no longer just about justice for Kyle or freedom for herself. This was about vengeance for her father, the man Corbin had systematically dismantled and discarded. She now had the location of the proof and the motive to fuel her fight. All she needed was a way to get it into the right hands. With the ledger hidden and her father's confession confirming the depth of Corbin's depravity, Clara May knew she couldn't act alone. Kyle had the skills for the wilderness, but exposing Corbin required navigating the town's corrupt legal system. They needed someone on the inside, a man with a badge who couldn't be bought. Their best, and perhaps only hope, was Deputy Owen Hayes. Hayes was a younger man, ambitious and seemingly earnest. He had always been polite to her, tipping his hat, and offering a kind word, a stark contrast to the deferential fear most townspeople showed her. He had a reputation for being thorough, for asking questions that Sheriff Miller, a man deep in Corbin's pocket, was happy to ignore. He seemed like the one honest lawman in Redemption Creek. Following Cale's discreet instructions, left for her in the form of a carved branch, pointing the way she met him in a secluded ravine miles from the ranch. She explained her new plan. Deputy Hayes Kyle's expression was doubtful. He stood with his arms crossed, blending into the mottled shade of the canyon wall. He is a man of the town. His loyalties are here. He's the only one who might listen, Clara May insisted. Sheriff Miller is a lost cause. Hayes asks questions. He seems decent, if we can present him with irrefutable proof. Proof that implicates his own boss. What choice will he have but to act? Kyle remained silent for a long moment, his dark eyes scanning the horizon, as if reading an answer in the distant mesas. There is much risk, he said finally. If you are wrong about him, Corbin will know everything. It's a risk we have to take, she argued, her voice gaining strength. That ledger can't stay hidden behind a painting forever. We need to get it out, and we need the law on our side when we do. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. The decision is yours, but you will not go to him alone. The plan was set. Clara May was to arrange a meeting with Hayes, pleading a personal matter, something a concerned wife might report, perhaps threats from a disgruntled former ranch hand. Kyle would remain out of sight, observing, ready to intervene if things went wrong. Clara May sent a message to the sheriff's office, and Hayes agreed to meet her the following evening at the edge of town near the old livery stable, a place public enough to seem innocent but quiet enough for a private conversation. As dusk settled, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, Clara May waited, her nerves stretched taut. Hayes arrived on time, his walk confident, his smile reassuring. "Mrs. Corbin," he said, tipping his hat. "I hope everything is all right." "Thank you for coming, Deputy." She began, her heart pounding. She started with the story they had concocted about a menacing figure seen lurking near the ranch. But as she spoke, she watched his eyes. They were attentive, sympathetic. He seemed to be exactly the man she'd hoped for. Emboldened, she decided to abandon the pretense. "Deputy, the real reason I asked you here is far more serious," she said, lowering her voice. "It concerns my husband and Sheriff Miller." Hayes's friendly demeanor didn't falter, but a new stillness came over him. "Go on." She told him everything. She spoke of the rustling, the Circle T brand, the coded ledger hidden in the study. She laid out the entire conspiracy, her voice gaining conviction with every word. She was exposing the biggest man in the territory, risking her life on the belief in this one man's integrity. When she finished, Hayes was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the dust at his feet. He finally looked up, his expression one of grave seriousness. "Mrs. Corbin, Clara May," he said, using her first name for the first time. "This is an incredible accusation. If what you say is true, it explains a great deal. The unsolved, rustling cases, Miller's refusal to investigate. I always suspected Corbin had his hooks in the sheriff, but this..." He shook his head, looking like a man whose worst fears had just been confirmed. "The ledger is the key. Without it, it's your word against his. You must get it." "I can," she said, relief flooding through her. "I know where it is." "Good," he said, his voice firming with resolve. "Here is what we'll do. Tomorrow night, Corbin is hosting a poker game for some men from Blackwood. It always runs late, that's your chance. Get the ledger, I'll be waiting for you an hour after midnight at the old mission. Bring it directly to me. Don't speak to anyone else. We can't risk tipping them off." It was the perfect plan. He had thought it through, taken control. She had been right to trust him. "Thank you, Owen." She breathed, a genuine weight lifting from her shoulders for the first time in months. "I knew I could count on you. "You're doing a brave thing, Clara May," he said, his expression sincere. "Justice is coming to Redemption Creek." As he walked away, Clara May felt a surge of triumph. She looked toward the rocks where Cale was hidden and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. But when Cale emerged from the shadows, after Hayes was long gone, his face was a grim mask. "What is it?" she asked, her newfound hope wavering. "He's going to help us." His eyes, Kyle said, his voice low and tight. When you spoke of the ledger, his eyes did not show surprise. They showed recognition. "What do you mean?" And he was too quick with a plan. Kyle continued his gaze, distant and troubled. A man hearing such a tale for the first time would have more questions. He would show doubt. Hayes showed only eagerness. A cold knot of dread began to form in Clara May's stomach. "No, you're mistaken. He's on our side." "I hope that I am," Kyle said, but his tone held no conviction. "But we will not proceed as he planned. I will go to the mission tomorrow night. You will stay at the ranch. If he is true, I will give him a message from you. If he is false—" He let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear. But Clara May, buoyed by the deputy's seeming sincerity and desperate to believe she had found a true ally, refused to see it. "You're being paranoid, Cale. He's our only chance. Trust is a rare stone in this valley, Clara May, and I fear you have given yours to a snake." The next night, against Cale's stern warning, Clara May retrieved the ledger. The poker game was loud and boisterous, providing the perfect cover. She slipped into the study, retrieved the book from behind the painting, and wrapped it in sackcloth. But Kyle's words had planted a seed of doubt. She decided on a compromise. She wouldn't go to the mission, but she wouldn't stay at the ranch either. She rode to a high ridge overlooking the mission, the ledger heavy in her saddlebag, determined to see for herself that her faith in Deputy Hayes was justified. From her vantage point, she saw a lone figure on horseback approach the mission, ruin an hour past midnight. It was Hayes. He dismounted and waited. A few minutes later, another rider appeared. Not Cale. This man was large, broad-shouldered. Even from a distance, she recognized the brutish silhouette of Caleb Thorne Corbin's foreman. And then a third rider, Bartholomew Corbin himself. Her blood turned to ice. She watched in horror as Hayes spoke with the two men, gesturing, pointing back towards the town. There was no confrontation, no arrest. It was a meeting of conspirators. She had not delivered them a key to justice. She had delivered them the blueprint of their own downfall and told them exactly where she would be. The meeting at the livery, her confession, it had all been a lie, a performance to win her trust. A guttural cry of betrayal escaped her lips. Kyle had been right. She had walked them straight into a trap, and she had sent Kyle to spring it. Panic seized her. She spurred Daisy, racing down the treacherous slope toward the mission, her only thought to warn Cale. But she was too late. As she neared, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed through the night, followed by another. She saw a fleeting shape, Kyle stumble from the shadows of the adobe walls, pursued by Thorne. She saw the flash of a pistol in Cale's hand, a return shot that made Thorne cry out and fall back. But Kyle was hurt. He was limping badly, clutching his side as he disappeared into the labyrinth of rocks and canyons beyond the mission. Corbin and Hayes mounted up, ready to give chase. Clara May reined in Daisy, hidden in a thicket of mesquite, her heart shattering with guilt and terror. She had trusted the wrong man. And now Cale, the only person who had ever offered her a shred of hope, might pay for her mistake with his life. The shadow of betrayal had fallen, and it had consumed everything. The ride back to the Corbin ranch was a blur of self-loathing and chilling fear. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing hoofbeat. Clara May stumbled into the house through the kitchen entrance, just as the first hint of dawn was bruising the eastern sky. She hid the ledger, the cause of all this turmoil, back in its hiding place behind the painting, in the study, her hands shaking so violently she could barely function. Corbin had not yet returned. He and his men were still out there, hunting Kyle. She had never felt so utterly and devastatingly alone. Her father was gone. Her only ally was wounded, bleeding, and being pursued by killers because of her catastrophic misjudgment. The passive victim was gone, burned away by the fires of betrayal. The weeping bride was a distant memory. In their place stood a woman, cornered a woman with nothing left but a desperate, dangerous resolve. She would not wait to be discovered. She would not wait for Corbin to return and pass his cold, final judgment. She would act. Her mind, sharpened by adrenaline, began to work frantically. The ledger was useless without a way to decode it. And even if she could, who could she take it? To the law was corrupt. The town was cowed. She was on her own. Corbin Hayes Thorne, they thought they had won. They thought she was a foolish girl, and Cale was a dead man. Their arrogance, as Cale had said, was their weakness. And she would use it. She needed two things: a distraction and the cipher to the ledger. She spent the day in a feverish state of activity, forcing herself to maintain a semblance of normalcy for the sake of the household staff. She instructed the maids feigned a headache and kept to her rooms. But her mind was racing. The key to the ledger had to be something Corbin kept close, something he wouldn't think to hide, because he believed no one would ever see the ledger itself. She thought back to his habits, his private moments. He had a small, intricately carved wooden box on his nightstand, where he kept his collar studs and a pocket watch from his father. It was the only sentimental object she had ever seen him possess. That evening Corbin returned his face, a thunderous mask of frustration. Thorne was with him, his arm in a sling. "The half-breed vanished," Corbin snarled to his foreman as they stood in the foyer, not bothering to lower their voices, disappeared into the canyons like a puff of smoke. But he's wounded. He won't get far. "What about your wife?" Thorne growled, casting a dark look up the staircase. "She suspects nothing," Corbin said with dismissive certainty. "She's probably in her room crying over a book of sonnets. She did her part, leading him to us. The fool girl served her purpose." The words meant to be overheard by any listening servants were a cold comfort. He didn't suspect her of duplicity, only of stupidity. She could still use that. Her plan began to coalesce. It was reckless, insane, but it was all she had. Later that night, after Corbin was asleep, his snores filling the house with a guttural rhythm, Clara May began her work. She slipped into his dressing room. There on the nightstand was the carved box. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside, amongst the gold and pearl studs, was a small folded piece of paper. She opened it. It was a grid of letters and numbers, a simple substitution cipher. At the bottom were two words: Pater Altissimus. Highest Father. Corbin, the god of his own small, corrupt world. This was it. Her second task was the distraction. She crept downstairs to the kitchens. From the pantry she took a tin of kerosene and a box of matches. Her destination was the barn, not the main stables where the prize horses were kept, but the old dry hay barn on the western edge of the property. It was far enough from the house to pose no immediate threat, but the blaze would be visible for miles, a beacon of alarm that would draw every man on the ranch, including Corbin. She moved like a phantom through the night. The barn was filled with the sweet, dry scent of hay. It felt like sacrilege, setting a fire on a ranch, the lifeblood of this land. But it was a necessary sacrifice. She doused a pile of loose hay in the center of the barn, her hands slick with the oil. She struck a match. The flame flared to life, a tiny, dangerous star in the darkness. For a moment, she hesitated. This was the final threshold. Once this fire was lit, there was no turning back. Thinking of Cale, bleeding somewhere in the dark, and her father broken and exiled, she tossed the match. The hay ignited with a hungry whoosh. Flames climbed the dry tinder with astonishing speed, painting the interior of the barn in a terrifying, dancing light. She didn't wait to watch. She ran circling back toward the house as shouts began to erupt from the bunkhouse. She slipped back into the silent house and went straight to the study. With the cipher in hand, she retrieved the ledger. Working by the light of a single oil lamp, her hands stained with kerosene and soot, she began to decipher the coded entries. The truth that emerged was worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just her father. Corbin had systematically ruined a dozen smaller ranchers using rustling forged documents and control of the water rights to bankrupt them before buying their land for pennies on the dollar. He had payoffs listed to Sheriff Miller, to a land surveyor, and even to a federal judge in the territorial capital. The name Owen Hayes was there next to a series of regular payments described as information services. It was a meticulous record of a criminal empire. As the orange glow of the barn fire grew brighter, reflecting in the study window, Clara May finished her work. She tore the translated pages from her notebook and stuffed them along with the original cipher and the red ledger into a leather satchel. The house was stirring now. She could hear Corbin shouting orders from the front porch. This was her chance. She scribbled a hasty note and left it on Corbin's desk, a final piece of misdirection. He came for me. The Apache. He set the fire. He has the ledger and he's taking me with him. Find us if you can. Let him believe she was a captive, not a conspirator. Let his rage be focused on the man he was already hunting. Slinging the satchel over her shoulder, she slipped out the back of the house. She didn't take her horse. A horse could be tracked. She set out on foot into the same wilderness that had swallowed Cale, guided by a desperate prayer and the fierce, burning light of her own redemption's fire. She was no longer running from Corbin. She was running toward a final confrontation, armed with the truth that could burn his world to the ground. The unforgiving canyons nearly broke her, but Clara May found Kyle pale and weak from a cauterized bullet wound hidden within a rock alcove. Exhausted, her feet bleeding, she pushed the satchel containing the decoded ledger toward him. "I started a fire," she explained breathlessly. "Corbin thinks you kidnapped me. He's hunting us both." Their relief was shattered when Deputy Hayes appeared, tracking them with grim determination. As he raised his rifle, Clara May stepped from the shadow's pistol steady and shot the traitor from his horse. The gunshot was a summons. Moments later, Corbin and his men swarmed the clearing, trapping them. "You—" Corbin snarled his face, twisting with disbelief and fury as he finally understood her deception. Before he could give an order, a new voice echoed from the rim above. "Drop it, Corbin!" Cale's allies, the very ranchers Corbin had ruined, stood silhouetted against the sky, a dozen rifles aimed down at them. Checkmated and defeated, Corbin's sanity snapped. "If I am ruined," he screamed, aiming his pistol directly at Clara May, "I will take you with me!" With a final agonizing effort, Kyle launched himself forward. The struggle was brief and brutal ending. Corbin's reign of terror for good. Weeks later, the ledger had brought federal marshals, and justice was slowly returning to the valley. Clara May, once again, mistress of her family's reclaimed ranch, stood on the porch as Cale approached. He said nothing, simply held out a single sun-colored desert marigold. She took it, and looking from the simple flower to the man who had risked everything, a true radiant smile lit up her face. the lonely Apache had kept his promise. The story of Clara May and Kyle is a testament to the fire that can be forged in the harshest of circumstances, a story of how a whispered promise can become a revolution. It reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. From a bride's tears to a warrior's resolve, Clara May's journey shows that even in the most lawless of lands, justice can be seized by those brave enough to fight for it. If their story of resilience, betrayal, and ultimate triumph moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it. Share this video with a friend who loves a powerful tale of the Old West. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring history to life. Your support allows us to keep telling these tales. Thank you for listening.